Hello, everyone. This is Dan Graves. I am the CTO at Delphix and have been here for many years working with our customers and our partners and our internal teams on creating the Delphix DevOps test data management platform. And with me today, we have a special guest, Matty Stratton. So Matty's been a member of the DevOps community for a long time, 20 years of experience in all kinds of IT operational jobs, from companies like JP Morgan Chase to internet companies like apartments.com. He also speaks internationally, presenting at Agile, DevOps focused events, including DevOps Enterprise Summit, DevOps Days, Interop, Pink, and others worldwide. He's also the founder and co-host of the popular Arrested DevOps podcast, as well as organizers of the DevOps Day set of conferences. I love the Arrested DevOps name, by the way, because of, there's always money in the banana stands. But he lives in Chicago. He's got 3 kids, and he's currently on a mission, actually, to discover the best pho in the world. All right. So, Matty, how are you doing today?
Good. You'll appreciate the tagline for our podcast of Arrested DevOps is "There's always DevOps in the banana stand." And
perfect.
So you're right on. No, doing great here.
Okay. Well, so today we want to. Oops, sorry. Say that again. I typed over you. I mean, talked.
It's finally getting warm and nice and muggy here in Chicago.
Yeah, I heard that. My family lives nearby, and it went from 40s to 90s overnight. So, look, today we're going to talk a lot about DevOps and developers and testers working in that world. So, let's get started. As we both get a chance to talk to companies all around the world who are trying to adopt DevOps, and they're partway along that journey. And so, I wanted to talk about some of the big challenges that companies are facing as they go through this. So, Matty, maybe you can help us get started on this. When you're out there working with organizations, what do you see as some of the top inhibitors to becoming fully DevOps?
I think there's a couple places where this comes into play when it comes to obstacles. One is approaching it only as a technology problem, right? Which is, okay, we're gonna go buy some DevOps, right? We're gonna get this tool or whatever. And I always like to say, you can't buy DevOps, but I can definitely sell it to you. So when we look at it as a way of, we're going to solve this with tech, and tech is part of it. But we're talking about a socio-technical system. The other, and we dig into that a lot more, but another place that it gets interesting is when you have, especially in a large organization, there can be a lot of disconnect between what we're even talking about with this kind of change from leadership and your practitioners, right? We talk about, the folks who are doing chop wood, carry water versus vision, and it's not necessarily ever by intent, but we see a lot of challenges. I see a lot of challenges in organizations between work as imagined versus work as done. So, and in resilience engineering spaces, well, a lot of times we'll talk about the sharp end versus the blunt end of an organization. The blunt end is where a lot of decisions get made and everything. The sharp end is where the chopping wood and carrying water happens. And it's not uncommon that I've had conversations with senior leaders in organizations who are very into this, right? They want to make this transformation, but their understanding of how work gets done is based according to what was desired, right? This is our theory. This is how we do it. And then you go talk to individual contributors, you talk to squads, you talk to teams. That's not actually how work is happening. So when you have those disconnects, making a fundamental organizational change can sometimes, at the best case, it just ends up being a lot of glossed over stuff, which says, yes, we're doing this, but we're not actually changing anything. Worse, you just drive even more of a disconnect between work as imagined versus work as done. So those are some of the biggest challenges, I think, is how do you get that understanding of where that happens? And there's a lot of incentives. There's a lot of reasons that's hard for people to do. It has a lot to do with the organization having a high level of psychological safety. And I just want to talk about that for 1 second. I know I'm answering a whole bunch of things all at once, but
perfect.
Just a fun reason that I always come back to this idea of psychological safety. And I think it's really important, especially for leaders to be aware of, is I keep wanting to say a few years ago, but it was more than a few years ago. Google did a project internally where they evaluated what was common in high performing teams. It was called Project Aristotle. They said, okay, they looked at the highest performing teams inside of Google and said, what do they have in common? Because we want to make more of these things, right? And what they found is the things that were most in common for elite performing teams had nothing to do with the things that we normally might have thought. It had nothing to do with, or very little to do with, where they were located. So like co-located teams, that didn't really matter as much. It had less to do with the experience or their skills. But one of the things they found that was very true, was true of almost every high performing team at Google, was a high level of psychological safety. And what that means in a nutshell, it's something we could talk about for a whole hour, but quickly, is when people have a high level of psychological safety, it means they feel that they do not have a fear of being punished or made fun of for speaking up, right? So being able to say, hey, this is my chain, this is my idea, or I think we should do this differently. And when you don't have that psychological safety, that drives even more of a divide between work as imagined versus work as done. You get a lot of showing the flag. Yeah, okay, sure, we'll do whatever. The difference, I talk about people being committed versus being compliant. When you make a change, you want people coming along for your organizational change to be committed, which means they have to understand things. Which a lot of times in senior leadership, we're used to, need to know, right? Like, how much do we share? And we can usually share a lot more than we think we can.
Yeah, interesting. Let me just build on a couple things you said there. So I've talked to so many of these upper managers over the last few years who think of their job ultimately as head of change management, right? I met one a couple of weeks ago in New York who literally changed his title to Chief Transformation Officer from Chief Information Officer, just to think through, how am I going to get this whole organization to actually adopt and go down these different transformation journeys that we're trying to do. And a lot of it really is managing the culture, managing the values, and getting people inspired, to your point, getting individual contributors throughout the organization and mid-management all thinking about, why are we going here? What are the changes we're trying to make for the organization? What are the real outcomes we're trying to prepare ourselves to be able to deliver? Because if you get a little, you're somewhere in the organization and you get a ticket to make some change, maybe there's resistance if you don't understand the mission and what you're trying to get to. But if you can get people, so, as a leader, as a CIO, as a CTO, there's a new opportunity to be a different kind of leader than sometimes has existed, right? If you look at the sort of the archetypes of CIOs, you have operational managers, you have technology enthusiasts, you have business leaders. But ultimately, I think one of the ways that some of the modern leadership for these organizations are thinking about it is they're almost a convergence of different roles at once. So there's that transformation officer kind of hat to wear. There is more of a product leader hat to wear, where you're thinking about the products and services and capabilities for the organization as they're transitioning from thinking of themselves as IT organizations to thinking of themselves more as product companies, software engineering companies who are building these experiences for their customers. So I think those are really important changes. And the second thing that I wanted to mention is we've seen a lot of interesting examples where there's this kind of conflict between centralized and decentralized DevOps adoption, right? Centralized, it's, built somewhere in the middle. Everyone's either supposed to, required to, or encouraged to adopt that particular CI/CD tool chain and methodology and set of tools, right? And the other one, though, is everyone's empowered to go build their own. And you get organizations with 37 different pipelines, and some of them are efficient and some of them not. And there's a lot of wasted effort. And when you try to bring things together to test, big fancy services that span all of these different individual teams, lots of things just don't work. So I've seen that be a struggle, because on one hand, you want to empower these individual developers and develop DevOps tools engineers to build and create and grow, but yet you don't actually want 37 different ways of doing it across the company.
It's interesting. there's two things. One thing I'm just going to make a mention because I'll forget later. But when he talked about this being about change management, and it's funny because we repurpose words, and so I love to talk about change management, but not ITSM change management. CCRBs give me the shivers because I've sat in too many of them. But people say, like, what's the most important DevOps book I should read? And I would say there's two. One, go read Freakonomics, go learn about incentives. But number two is there's this book by Chip and Dan Heath called Switch, and it's about change. And I cannot tell you, if you read this book and you see how many talks I've given over the years, you're like, Matty, you just stole everything from the Heaths. But there's a lot to do with how we manage change. But I want to go back now and follow up, like when you talked about, again, this sort of like, do we have this mandate that comes from on high, and this is how all squads work versus just let everybody do what they want, so to speak, and that empowerment. And there is a tension, right? Because the answer is somewhere in between. And I will be honest, it's different based on your organization. So there is a sort of a push-pull. But one of the little rules, because I've sort of over the last couple of years been, and especially I feel like I've had this conversation a lot in the last year about like when, like, because there's a lot of tools that come into our DevOpsing, right? And so the thing is, back when I said there's no one right thing, because it's not like, yes, all tools should be centralized. I mean, procurement wants you to do that, of course, and, economy of scale, but also it's not every tool should be up for grabs. And it's like, well, what's the rubric you use to sort of decide where you allow it? Because it's not all or nothing. And one of the places I've sort of found that makes sense to me is the more collaborative the tool, the more it has to be standard, right? So if it's something that it exists within the box of your squad, probably you do whatever the heck you want. What framework, JavaScript framework you use for your front end within your own little service. Who cares? Do your thing, because that lives in the contractual black box that is your product team, right? But then you think about, like, a classic example, people do this all the time, but like your ticketing system, like that probably should be pretty consistent. Or here's the other thing. It either needs to be something that is consistent or has a really good bridge to what is the common, right? So maybe you're like, again, that's sort of look at it like, should everybody in the whole org be using Jira? Maybe not. Maybe people want to do, in the product side, they want to store stories in some other way, but it makes sense for another team to be doing something in, say, Jira. Well, you don't, because when you try to force everybody into one, then you end up spending a lot of time engineering to make a tool do what isn't supposed to be. But if that's going to work, you better have some dang good integrations. And I think one of the places where you see you really, and you alluded to it, you mentioned with pipelines. So I've sort of been thinking about, I'm trying to get myself away from saying pipeline, because it's not always about a pipeline, but these tools in these places, and waiting for this to catch on. I'm starting to think about them as a enterprise DevOps bus. Like we had enterprise service buses, right? So it's kind of like your tool there is the bus upon which all of your value delivery rides. So something like that, you need some consistency, because again, like you said, stuff is going to eventually come together. Now, but inside that bus, inside that pipeline, you also have as much opportunity for where the black boxes can happen. And that's even going back to, if we think about the principles of Agile, right? A delivery team is supposed to be, there's an input and an output contract, just like a service, right? So cool. So the stuff that matters where you have a connection, yes, you need to have some standard connector way to do it. But what happens, and even if you think about how your feedback loops go, if you're like, this part is all just me, cool, do it however you want, right? But okay, wait, now I hit the point where this is something else. So I either have to have a really clean way. And the other thing is, where do you provide value? And this is, I think, a thing that I think a lot of organizations struggle with, about focusing on value differentiation. I did work in the public sector for a little while. And so this is why the joke I would make, maybe I'm talking to the CIO of, a federal agency. I'm like, you're not the US Department of Continuous Delivery, right? Why would you build your own bespoke CD tool? We see this a lot in enterprises too, because I think there's this belief that that's how you attract talent, right? Oh, cool. We'll get people, they know they'll be able to build cool stuff. But, you're a retailer, you sell shoes, you don't build testing tools, or you don't build your own incident response system,
right?
So not only are you probably not going to do it well, it's not. So how do you get into that place, and you're focusing on your differentiator?
Yeah. So let's talk about that, focusing on the differentiators a little bit more. One of the stats I saw recently that was actually shocking to me was from a survey by IDC. And what they did is they went out across a whole bunch of different IT organizations, and they asked companies to measure how much time per week developers were actually producing functional code, producing those features that differentiate you as a shoe store, easier to customize and order, whatever it is, versus either building tooling, waiting for someone else to respond to a ticket, going through the process and the bureaucracy of whatever the SDLC definitions are. And the answer average was 16%. 16% of time, these developers were producing functional code. 84%, they're doing something else. And so let's talk a little bit about that. First of all, like, what is the 84 that they're doing? And second, what have you seen as best practices to try to get to flip it, basically? I talked to Dell a few weeks ago, and they put a North Star out there internally as an organization to go from 16 to above 80. And they made it by eliminating all kinds of wait times, automating things that were wasting time, et cetera, et cetera. Basically taking the continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous test, continuous data approach to streamline all of these things and allow people to actually get more days back per week. And so again, what have you seen as the challenge, and what have you seen as the ways to get better?
So one of the big, you alluded to a couple things that we can do better. Is a lot of it's bureaucracy, and I feel like Agile. This is like, you kind of see a lot of when people adopt Agile and mostly in ceremony and not in spirit, you end up with scenarios where you could theoretically spend half of your week in meetings, right? That don't have to be. So I think you do find efficiencies of saying, sort of the joke is this meeting could have been an email, but are there ways? That said, sometimes we over rotate, because I think that, so one thing I sort of, my ears were pricking up about the, measuring developer productivity by amount of time they're writing code. And that's not necessarily the whole thing, because actually I think developers can become better developers by not always pounding code all the time. Now, do I think they become better developers by filing tickets and sitting in meetings that they have nothing to do with? And no. But the more that so the thing is, we want to bring that number up, but it's the overall productivity impact. And it's the more that they understand the value, they understand what they're trying to do, what the product is, what their customer is. So those things can come in, but those also rarely actually happen because that's happening at a different level. So I think we want to shift a little bit, but where a lot of that muda, right, a lot of that waste happens is just like you said, a lot of it is process and bureaucracy. And unfortunately, it also is a matter of early detection of bugs versus not, right? Because we're much more effective the earlier. So again, if we have better testing around every layer earlier, we're able to spend more time writing the code than going back and having to untangle all this stuff. Because wow, if I knew about this 2 weeks ago, I could have fixed it. But now we built all this stuff on top of it, and now the security team is coming and saying, no, you can't do this at all, right? So shifting left, and I say that term really carefully because there's a lot of nuance to those two words. So when I say shift left, I don't mean put all the work on the people on the left. It means move. It's not shifting work to the people more leftmost. It's shifting focus and the people that go with it, who are the experts. So this happens a lot with security and with the DevSecOps stuff, where they're like, oh, well, developers are now responsible for security. No, you actually have, that is an expertise. But what we're saying is don't get your security team involved during the hardening sprint. Like, they should be part of the feature and all this stuff, right? So the more we're doing that, so the more that you can look at it. One of the rubrics to do is look at your meetings and say, like, what forward motion happened with this? And mostly, one of the worst uses of a meeting is a status update, right? So like one of the things I've seen people get a lot of effectiveness with is saying, we look at, people only attend meetings where decisions are being made in that moment, and they need to be there for it, right? But how many meetings do we have that are showing a 2x2 and just reporting status to stakeholders and all of this stuff, that clearly could have been done asynchronously? And we also tend to, bring a lot of people into them because we're like, well, I need someone to help support this and argue the point and all this. And all we're doing is providing status. I think we see a lot of ceremonies that are, again, so that's the first thing is look at and say, was a decision or an action, did a decision or action come out of this meeting? If not, we probably don't need to have it anymore. That will free up a lot of focus. But then finally, it's just look at, so much of DevOps we take from lean manufacturing. That's why in the columns is the L is lean. So the more, if you're looking to improve productivity, you have to look at your value stream, which means look at that from commit to cash. How much time between a commit to that you realize revenue or idea to what's in front of a customer? Follow that whole path and find your biggest bottleneck. And I will tell you the other thing too, another important, if you read the goal, which was about manufacturing, was the inspiration for the Phoenix project. And part of it, one of the theory of constraints, right? So any improvement in your stream, in your chain that is not at the point of the largest bottleneck actually makes things worse, right? So we'll do that a lot. We'll be like, oh, well, I'm making the developers more productive and I'm giving them all this stuff, but our deployments are still super slow, right? That actually makes it worse because the deployments get even worse because now all this work is queuing up. Or you have people on the other end, your testers, let's say, again, I'm oversimplifying, are sitting there waiting and doing nothing. So one of the hardest things, but the way you improve this is to not look at it at improving developer productivity. That's an outcome that will come of optimizing your value stream.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I've seen a lot of people trying to figure out what the metrics are to measure their organization, right? We talked about, percent of coding, which is maybe useful, maybe not. You see pushes per month or pushes per unit of time. One of the ones I like recently, I've heard more though, is user story velocity. So some organizations have standardized, I'll say, the size of a user story so that you can't game the system by putting out 100 tiny ones in the same amount of time that was 10 big ones. But then what you can do is use that as a way of measuring basically the rate of, idea to features being implemented and deployed. With some unit of the size of the feature being the user story. And so you can see if you can improve what's the rate that our organization is putting out these capabilities that matter to the business, matter to our customers, matter to that world. So, building on that a little bit, I think that one of the things, as you talked about shifting left, which is probably shifting right in Japan and other right to left countries. Yeah, it's very Western based, but is figuring out how to do a lot of things in earlier that used to need to wait for other parts of the organization to bring to bear their expertise and their equipment and their whatever. I mean, performance testing is something that occurs to me there, right? You have a lot of these sprints where you're working on small systems, and then I do another sprint and another sprint, and 6 weeks later, we finally go load that app onto the big production-like gear or run a day of performance tests and find that we have some issues that were discovered or not discovered. I just discovered them now, but it happened anytime during that last 6 weeks. Versus what if you could be continually running maybe Delta performance testing every time someone makes a commit? This thing that we timed just went from 20 milliseconds to 80 milliseconds. Something critical happened in the code and only 4 people checked in since the last build. So we can narrow it down really quickly and discover those issues more easily. So I think a lot of organizations are doing, finding ways to improve, modernize their testing world, modernize their testing approaches so that they can do a lot of things in parallel and earlier. And as companies do that, they're also finding that obviously they're reducing the cost of making those fixes and finding those issues, but they're getting to a higher quality overall outcome as well.
It's really, I mean, the cloud lets us do this because I think back to all my ops experience and you'd have a performance track, and it was a big deal to go into perf because first of all, it was very expensive because I had to have full production quality size that probably sat around doing nothing a lot of the time. And I could only have one project go through because I certainly we could have again, this was very almost pre-agile, but we might have 3 QA tracks for simultaneous work for functional testing, but I couldn't afford to make all of those. So then you had to fight to who could get into perf. And so this takes forever. Right. Well, your perf environment, if it's, maybe it's, container orchestra, whatever it is, like you can scale that up and run it for 10 minutes and tear it down. Like I could not do that with my Proliance and my racks, right? Like, and then that makes you, but there's a lot of reasons like perf is also still perceived as very expensive because a lot of us still think that way. And we think about having a separate perf environment. And even to your point, it's like maybe just part of your testing is, okay, we got along. Now spin up 100 containers or 100 pods, boom, 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 boom. Okay, cool. It was just part of our, it's the same thing with security testing. Security is just another aspect of quality, and things are getting way better in this space. But not even a few years ago, the types of security testing tools we had were so prohibitively expensive that, for example, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, and I think they've gotten better. But when I used to talk about this, if you went to your organization and said, I need to get a Qualys seat for every developer in my organization, with how expensive that was, there was no way. So you couldn't afford to democratize that testing. So of course it had to happen in a hardening sprint. But if you can say, cool, my subject matter experts of my InfoSec team or my DevSecOps team or whatever, they can define this, but we can give it further down the chain so it can be determined. And that's just fundamentally capable. Like, again, these were things we weren't capable of doing before because of, in some cases, the laws of physics in the case of physical hardware, or the laws of procurement, right? Or just, because the tools were so expensive, because the pricing of those tools were mapped towards the way people used them. So, again, if you're selling a security tool, most customers had 3 people in the org that used it. Well, I want to maximize some money, so I need to charge a lot per seat, which then sort of had that fun effect of then nobody did more, and it changed the whole way we did work. But now people are wanting that more. So you're seeing more of being able to push that capability. But it's not putting the burden. That's sort of my thing. I'm like, when you push the stuff to the left, give the capability, but the burden is not there, because it ends up being just even that much more work. And we don't have 10x people. I'm sorry. This is a misnomer, right?
I love the physics analogy. I think that as you change the physics of infrastructure with infrastructure as a service and cloud and other capabilities, as you change the physics of the software dev lifecycle with tools like Jenkins or containers or whatever, and then as you change the physics of data with technologies like Delphix, it's really interesting, because all the things that used to take a week or two and now take a few minutes, it changes what you can do. And I think it's interesting to see organizations as they go through this, learning how the physics is different, and then looking at their existing processes and procedures and say, well, if the physics had been different from the beginning, would I have designed that process in that way? And of course, the answer is no. If running a certain kind of tests costs $10,000 and now it costs $20, maybe you want to run 1,000 times more of them per week, earlier and often. But those light bulbs in organizations, many times it's an iterative process, right? You understand new possibilities as each component under your stack, the physics is moved. And so you keep evolving those approaches.
How do you get yourself to just to understand the art of the possible, right? Because the reality has changed. And, you mentioned the Delphix thing. I sit there and I think so much about perf environments that I built that were just how much of it was just data load, right? To be able to get to that. And it wasn't just the work that I had to do on my sysadmin team to build the stuff. It was like, okay, now DBAs, now let's go do a whole data. It would take literally almost a day to do a data refresh of a test environment. And so there's a lot of stuff that my grizzled old sysadmin looks back at and being like, man, I wish I was a sysadmin now. This is way more fun.
Yeah. Well, to your point,
it has its own annoyances. That's the only difference. And again, and you know what? Everyone who's an SRE now, because we're not sysadmins anymore, 20 years from now, they're going to be like, everything's better now. And it was, oh my God, can you remember when Kubernetes was a thing? Well,
to your point earlier, I think what we're doing is enabling people like sysadmins, like developers, like testers to move up the I'm going to call it the value chain. It's a slightly different use of it, but they can deliver more value because they're building on the building blocks of those before them, right? You don't have to build your own, configuration management anymore. There's plenty of them to choose from. So you can focus on things that actually matter to the company, actually matter to the business. And as you know, if you think about all of the employee sat surveys and the books about them and so on, people really care about being able to see that the work that they do is tied to outcomes that actually help the company be more successful, grow revenue, do something that matters. And so I feel like as the DBAs can move up from doing backups and restores in your last example up to actually higher value, performance engineering and modernization and other things, because they're not stuck refreshing environments for all these developers, they can do more and they like their job better.
We could have a huge conversation about how ops is a skill, right? And it's beyond the rudimentary day-to-day copying files. I just want one last this way to put a bow on that last bit. Adam Jacob is the founder of creator of Chef, and does a bunch of other system engineering stuff. But he said once, and this really resonated with me, he said, people want to do really good work, and a lot of people haven't had the chance to do really good work in a really long time. And so as we look at the things that we do with the tools that we try to help people with in these processes, I think that's what we're doing. We're trying to enable people to be able to do really good and really important work. And that's why I love being in this space.
I agree. I think that if you look at, there's a quote from Satya Nadella I like, which said, given the choice any day of the week, he would invest in helping his engineers be more productive than investing in one new feature, right? Making sure that everyone can contribute to making the next person's, project go more efficiently, and the whole kind of exponential factor of that productivity. But the other side of it is what we were talking about, how fun is it to work in that job? And, in an era of the Great Resignation and all these other possibilities, it seems more important than ever, perhaps, to make sure that these great teams in your organization, the developers and the testers and the operators, all have as much help as they can get from automation, from eliminating the busy work, and from enabling them to go build new things. Because back to my Dell example, if you can code 4 days a week instead of 1 day a week, that is a lot more fun place to work. So Matty, thanks very much for the time today. I really appreciate it. It's been great having you on, and I look forward to our next conversations.
Thanks so very much for having me on. This was great. Clearly, we have a lot more to talk about, and y'all can find me on Twitter at Matt Stratton if you want to argue about this stuff too. But thanks again, Dan.
Again, thanks, Matt, for all of the super interesting conversation today. It's great to hear about what you're seeing out there in the world as companies adopt DevOps in the real world, and go through the culture changes and go through learning about what they can do, the art of the possible with changing the physics of everything they have to manage, whether it's infrastructure and code and data. And for future information, feel free to go look at Delphix.com, and also go check out mattstratton.com, mattstratton.com, for more information about what we've been talking about today. Thanks very much, everybody.